Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I apologize for the technical difficulties. We are going to record this webinar, so if you have friends who couldn't get in, it will be available later that they can watch on a recording. So I want to welcome everyone to the this overview of the Florida MPJE. Let me start my video so you can see me. We're very pleased that you were able to join us today. We've got, I know, students registered from every pharmacy school in Florida. So we want to welcome all the new grads from Florida. We also have some out-of-state 2020 pharmacy grads. So I want to congratulate you as well. And we also have several pharmacists that are seeking licensure in Florida. So I want to welcome all of you to this overview. A couple logistical things other than the technical issues we're having. Everyone should be on mute because it's a webinar and we have a lot of people. You can use the chat function and we'll try to address any issues that continue to come up during the webinar and answer any questions that you may have. What I'd like to do is get my slides working, and now we're having more technical difficulties because that's not working. There we go. This is me. My name's Gary Cacciatore. I want to just give you a little bit of background about myself. I am the president of Florida Pharmacy Regulatory Advisors, which is a company that we formed to help with Florida MPJE reviews and services, and it's something that we've been offering for a long time in Texas, and we've recently expanded into Florida. My full-time job, though, is I'm Vice President of Regulatory Affairs with Cardinal Health, and in that job, I monitor state pharmacy boards all over the country. So I kind of I have good insight of what's going on with far as pharmacy laws throughout the country. In addition to that, I'm also an adjunct and associate professor at the University of Houston College of Pharmacy, where I teach the pharmacy law course. And more recently, I've joined the faculty at the University of Florida College of Pharmacy, helping them with some MPJE review courses and assignments, and which kind of culminated with this webinar and the book we're going to talk about a little bit later. I'll be talking a little bit more about that. So you might be asking, okay, what's a guy in Texas doing in Florida? It's a very good question. You know, I've been teaching pharmacy law in Texas for either full-time or part-time for over 25 years. And we've been doing MPJ reviews in Texas for a long time. And we have both a textbook that we write, that's a comprehensive book that all the Texas pharmacy schools use. And then about 5 years ago, we put together a more condensed version of the Texas book into an MPJE review guide. And that's been very, very successful. And the Texas schools have some of the highest passing rates on the MPJE. I always intended at some point to maybe go to expand that into another state, and Florida was always my state that I wanted to expand into, primarily because I'm originally from Florida. I graduated from the University of Florida College of Pharmacy. And of all the states that I track on my full-time job with Cardinal Health, Florida is probably the one state that I keep up with the most. You know, I go to some of the Florida Board of Pharmacy meetings still. So I'm still up to date with what's going on in Florida. And then what happened late last year was I got a call from the University of Florida asking me to join the faculty there and maybe assist them by writing a review book and helping teach a course where they do some reviews. So that kind of pushed things forward. And my thought was, I don't want to limit this opportunity to just University of Florida students. So that's probably the purpose of this webinar. And I have reached out to all the colleges of pharmacy in Florida, spoken with the deans or the associate deans or the law professors. They've also been very supportive, and that's probably how they got the word out about this webinar. So I appreciate that, and hopefully this will be an opportunity for everyone to get access to some of the same resources. So a couple of goals I have for the seminar today. The first one is we've only got an hour, so I'm just going to give you a general structure of what the MPJE is like, and some general guidelines on how best to approach this exam. I think a lot of the things that we talk about when I've done the review in Texas and other places apply to the MPJE no matter where you're taking it. Okay, and then I want to go through a list of the laws and rules I think you need to study, and talk a little bit about what some of the available resources are out there for you, because there's lots of them out there, I think. And then as we go through this, I'm hoping that we'll be able to master at least 4 helpful study tips. We have a lot of study tips in the review guide that we put together for Florida, but I'm giving you 4 examples of those here, and I hope to do that with an interactive style to get some more participation from all of you as well. So let me start, because I am a lawyer, with an introduction and a disclaimer. This company, Florida Pharmacy Regulatory Advisors, and myself as the presenter, we don't have any affiliation with NABP, and we also don't have any specific knowledge of the content on the Florida MPJE or any of the MPJE exams, because if we did, we wouldn't be able to teach this course, right? So the people who serve as item writers for the MPJE are not allowed to teach review courses. So we are just providing this information as a summary, as information that's either publicly available or what we think are the best way to study for this particular exam. Okay, I do want to try to get some interaction from the audience. So we're going to use Poll Everywhere. So if you have your phone available, if you could text the words Gary C 966 to 22333, that will get you into the Poll Everywhere app. You can also do it at your computer at pollev.com/GaryC966. That may be a little bit more difficult if you're on the computer already, but you should only need to send this text once. But I'll leave that up there for 1 minute to see if everybody can log in to get some interaction going here. Hopefully that will work. So just text Gary C966. I don't think it matters if it's capitalized or not, to the number 22333, and you should get a message back saying that you are in the system. So let's test that out and see if it works. And answer this question. My biggest concern is passing NAPLEX, passing MPJE, finding a job, or staying healthy. Oh, it looks like it's working, so that's good. All right, let's see how this goes. Good. I guess passing the MPJE makes sense. That's why you're on the webinar, I guess, but you can be honest here. All right. All right, that seems to be working. Very good, very good. And I put the stay healthy one there. Listen, I hope everyone is staying healthy. We're living in some unique times here with this pandemic situation, and my hope for all of you is that you are staying healthy, and you are, hopefully we'll be returning to normal or some sense of normal here, and that basically that allows you all to move on with your careers. I know it's a difficult time for those of you that are graduating. I feel for you. I have a high school senior, and he's dealing with a lot of the same issues about, potentially no graduation and those types of things. So hopefully your schools will be able to take care of you as far as graduations go, and you can move on with your career. So let's go ahead and get started then. I want to talk about the exam itself. The MPJE is a 120 item computerized exam. Out of those 120 items, only 100 items count towards your score. That means that 20 of the questions on this exam won't count towards your score. They're being pre-tested to see if they want to use those questions later on later MPJE exams. The issue though there is you don't really know which of those 20 questions don't count. So you have to answer all 120 questions to the best of your ability. But I think it's important to know that, because I don't want you to panic if you get a question that seems very similar to a question you already had. You don't want to assume that, oh gosh, I must have missed that question earlier because they're asking me something very similar. Why would they go back to that? Well, there's a couple of reasons they could go back to that. Number one, it could be that either the first question or the second question is being tested and doesn't count towards your score. So it's the same topic. And the other reason is, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is um, the way the exam is structured, you might get 2 or 3 questions on the same topic, because sometimes you have to pass a certain number of competencies to pass this exam. And sometimes, depending on the difficulty of the question, it might take 2 or 3 um, questions for you to pass a particular competency. So don't panic if you get questions that seem similar. Don't start doubting yourself and changing your answer. Be confident that you had the answer right the first time, and go with it. You do have 2.5 hours to take the exam. I've not heard that the time restraints are too difficult for people. Obviously, everyone's different. So if you're a slow exam taker and it takes you a little bit longer, that could be an issue. But just always be aware of the time limits that you do have. The exam being a computerized exam means that it actually adapts. It uses adaptive technology to select the next questions that you're going to get. So that means that everyone is not going to get the same questions, even if you sign up to take it at the same time for the same state. Okay, so and the way that works sort of is, like I mentioned, there's a certain number of competencies that you have to pass this exam. We'll talk about that in a moment. But each question on the exam does not count the same amount of points, okay? The passing score, you see the last bullet point there, is 75, but that's not 75%. It's not a straight up 75% of the questions correct. It's 75 on a scaled score, which means that they are looking at your particular exam and the questions that you got. And each question might be worth different amount of points, because they know by testing these questions which ones are more difficult than others. So you might get more credit for answering a more difficult question correctly, and that may cause you to already master that particular competency. So the adaptive technology, what it does, it supposedly is supposed to help you pass the exam by doing things like, if you miss a question, it may go back to that topic area again to give you another chance to pass that particular competency. And usually when it does that, it knows you missed that previous question. It will generally give you a slightly easier question. Because again, like I said, they know each question has a degree of difficulty, right? I've always joked with my students, like, if you came out of this exam saying, wow, that was really easy, you might be in trouble, because if the questions kept getting easier and easier, that might be a sign that you were missing the questions. I say that as a joke only because you will not come out of this exam saying, oh, that was really easy. Most students that I talk to say that was a difficult exam. They say the MPJE, they find it very detailed, and they find it, where they could get down to 2 answers sometimes, and it was difficult to choose. I think what happens with the MPJE is honestly, there's so much focus on the NAPLEX that people sometimes tend to blow off the MPJE. But the issue is, you've got to pass both of those if you want to practice. So it is not something you can blow off. And I think by being here today, you're not doing that. So that's great, because it is very detailed. And the other issue is, look, law's kind of a weird thing, right? I know that. I've been teaching it for 25 years. It's not people's favorite class. And you got to remember, your entire curriculum was built around pharmacy stuff and stuff that's on the NAPLEX. So chances are you're pretty prepared for the NAPLEX. You may have had one law course or had it integrated into your curriculum, and it's not a strength of to be honest, with a lot of schools and a lot of students even. So that's why the MPJE does tend to have slightly lower passing scores than the NAPLEX. The questions themselves are developed by people from the Board of Pharmacy, either Board of Pharmacy members or Board of Pharmacy staff, practicing pharmacists, and educators, some pharmacy law professors as well. And they may come from all over the country, but there will be state-specific questions. We'll talk about that in a moment. But there's a group of people who are item writers for NABP that write these questions, and they go through a rigorous trial period. So the questions should be, pretty valid questions if they're going to count towards your score. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what types of questions are on the MPJE. There are multiple choice questions, obviously, and there are two additional types of questions. There's multiple response questions and ordered response questions. The exam used to be all multiple choice, and at the time, they had a lot of those what are called K-type questions, which we often refer to as multiple choice questions, right? Where answer A is A and B, and answer B is C and D, and answer C is A, B, and C. I know students love those questions. Just kidding. Nobody likes those types of questions, right? Um, they have stopped writing K-type questions for the MPJE. I was able to confirm that with a colleague of mine who's one of the item writers. He obviously doesn't tell me what's on the exam, but I'm allowed to ask him, general structure questions. Because I asked them that, because I have heard students say, oh, I had quite a few of those K-type questions. So what he told me was, for the past 4 or 5 years, since they've added the multiple response questions and the ordered response questions, they've not been adding any additional of those K-type questions. But I can't tell you you're not going to have those. So you might, if you have them, they're probably older questions that are still in the data bank. So you might get some multiple choice questions that are the multiple choice questions, which obviously you have to read very carefully. The reason they got away from that, I think, is they realized people didn't like those types of questions, and they added this multiple response question. A multiple response question is very similar to one of those K-type questions. It will say select all that apply, and it'll have answers A, B, C, and D. And you have on the computer have to put a check mark or somehow mark off, A and B, or B and C, or A, B and C, or A, B, C, and D. So it's very similar to the multiple choice question. So make sure you're reading the questions carefully to know, hey, this is a multiple choice question. If I have to select all, make sure you select all. One hint or practical thing I could tell you is, if you get a multiple response question that says select all that apply, there's a pretty good chance that you need to select more than one. I mean, I can't tell you for certain that's the fact, but I'm pretty confident that if it's a multiple response question, there's going to be at least 2 questions that are applicable. Because you think about it, if it's only one, they probably would have made that a multiple choice question, right? So that's something I think could be helpful. If you're not sure about adding one and it's a multiple response question, my suggestion would be, yeah, it probably has at least 2 answers. The ordered response questions ask you to put things in order. Put the following in order based on the shortest time period to the longest time period. Or from the most strict to the least strict. And when we're talking about MPJE legal type questions, those are the most common ones I think you'll probably see, because we'll talk a little bit later about, time periods. You have so many time periods to notify the Board of Pharmacy about something, or there's a timeline. You have 7 days to do this, or 3 days to do this, or a day supply limit on a prescription that can be filled, right? All those types of situations make for, if I'm writing these types of questions, those make for easy ordered response questions, because, how well do you know this? Is something 72 hours or 7 days or 10 days? Or those are all things you can put in order from least to greatest or greatest to least. The big thing on those ordered response questions is make sure you're doing it in the right order, right? If it says the least to the most or the most to the least, make sure you don't do it backwards, where you knew the answer, but you just put it in backwards. So my understanding is you have to drag and drop these items across the screen to put them in the correct order. Just make sure you double check that you got them in the correct order, not the backwards order, before you hit submit. Because that's the other thing with this computerized exam, is once you hit submit, it's done. You can't go back and change an answer later. So be very careful on those ordered response questions. As far as the questions themselves, they are a mix of what I call knowledge-based questions and situational questions. They really are moving more towards situational questions, where they're going to give you a fact pattern, very much like the NAPLEX. If you've seen any of the practice questions for the NAPLEX, there's a lot of situational questions. They're doing that with the MPJE as well, where a pharmacist has these things occur, and then you have to apply the law to that situation. Okay, so that's a little bit different than a strict knowledge-based question, where you're strictly memorizing the answer. I do think you have to know the law and memorize a lot of stuff to understand law, but those situational questions are gonna ask you to apply the law to a specific situation, and it may not be obvious, and it may not be something that's covered exactly in the law, right? Let me give you an example. A situational question may talk about, the pharmacy is opening up in the morning, and the technicians have come in, the pharmacist has come in, they're getting ready to open the pharmacy, and at that pharmacy, they have an answering machine that takes prescription orders overnight, okay? And it may ask you about, can this technician in this situation take the orders off the answering machine? Well, is there a specific regulation or law that talks about answering machines? Probably not, right? To my knowledge, there's not one under the federal law. There's not one under federal law. Probably no state law has addressed that. Maybe they have, because some of these states get really, really specific, okay? But what that question is asking you to do is say, okay, well, do you understand the law says that only a pharmacist can take a new verbal prescription, right? So if it's a new prescription and it was called in on the telephone, who can take that new prescription off the answering machine would probably only be a pharmacist, right? But there's not a specific law that addresses answering machines. So you have to just understand what the purpose of that law is and apply it to that specific situation. So weird things like that will test your ability to really understand not just the law itself, but how I would apply it to a specific situation. Okay, we're gonna try a poll question. And don't be afraid to answer, because the purpose of this is not to test your knowledge, but just to point out some study tips like I talked about. So here's a question, and we'll see what kind of answers we get. Under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, what is the maximum days supply allowed on a verbal prescription for testosterone? All right. And if you're into the poll everywhere, is it A, 10 days, B, 30 days, C, 90 days, or D, there is no maximum days supply limit? All right. So we get lots of answers here. Everybody's on the board there. 10 days, 30 days, 8 days. I'm sorry, 90 days, 8% at 90 days. So, okay, so this is a really good example of two things. Okay, first of all, this is a question you will not see on the MPJE, right? Because it starts with the words under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, right? All right. So technically, the answer to this question is, I'm gonna lock the answers here. The technical answer to the question is actually D. Okay. Because under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, there is no, on a single prescription, there is no maximum days supply. Okay, and actually that's true on under the Federal Act, really for any single controlled substance prescription. But here's the problem, okay, with this question is you will not get a question that starts with the words under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, which of the following is true, or answer this question. Why is that? And that's our first study tip. Okay, the second bullet point there is there's no distinction on this exam between federal law and state law. So it's unfair for them to ask you a question that says under the federal law, which of the following is true, okay? You won't get that question. They're just gonna ask you, what is the maximum supply limit on a verbal prescription for testosterone, or a verbal Schedule 3 prescription, or something like that, right? That's the way the question has to be worded, because the underlying item there, you have to answer each question based on the requirements in Florida. Because remember, the general rule there at the first bullet point is when you got federal law and state law, you always have to follow the stricter law. So even though under federal law there is no limit, and that was the technical answer, a lot of you got it right under Florida law, right, which is the correct answer on the MPJE, because Florida law is kind of unique. It limits verbal prescriptions for Schedule 3 and Schedule 3 only to a 30-day supply. That's kind of a unique Florida requirement, right? So On the exam, the 30 days is the correct answer, but notice how it was worded. It was worded incorrectly. You won't get a question worded like that. And I want to point that out too when we talk about study resources a little bit later. If you get practice questions from other resources and you get a question that starts out with the words under the federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act or under the federal, just realize, hey, the answer in Florida could be different. That's not a really good question. And I've seen study guides out there that ask, because a lot of them are written to help you study federal law. Nothing wrong with those study guides, but always remember, look, if the state law is stricter, I got to follow the state law. Okay, or if the federal law is stricter, which doesn't happen as often, but it could happen where the federal law is stricter and you'd have to follow the federal law. So just remember when you go into this exam, answer the question according to the way the law is in Florida. Okay, so that's our first kind of study tip. All right. The last thing about the exam structure is the competency statements. Okay, and the MPJE has a list of competency statements. This is really the blueprint for the exam. So it's helpful to read that, right? Because every question on this exam is tied to one of those competency statements. Those item writers that we talked about, they can't just write a question without saying, okay, this question is to address this particular competency statement. So I think it's worthwhile to read those competency statements and make sure you understand them. I will say that they're a little bit difficult to go through because of sometimes they're written kind of broadly, okay? And you can get those competency statements when you go to register for the exam. When you download the NAPLEX at MPJE Bulletin, they have the competency statements in there for the MPJE. That I'm sure they have them for the NAPLEX as well. Okay, we've reproduced them in our review guide that we've published for you because we think they're important. Okay, I do want to point out some things on the competency statements. Remember, this is a multi-state pharmacy jurisprudence exam, so there could be competency statements on something that's really not covered in Florida, okay? And also sometimes the terminology could be a little bit different, okay? So if you see something on there and it's really not addressed in Florida law, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Unless it's covered under federal law, then you would still need to know it, okay? The reason I bring that up is as part of the work I've been doing for the University of Florida is I've been giving the P4 students some assignments, and one of the assignments was we divided up the competency statements, and I had them each find the answer to the competency statements. And what I found was sometimes there'd be a competency statement, and they would go find the answer, but it was in a place that really didn't apply. Okay, for example, one of the competency statements I think talks about responsibility to report suspected child abuse. And some of my University of Florida students found provisions in the Florida law that require certain healthcare practitioners to report child abuse. So I give them credit for finding it, but that's not something that's going to be on the MPJE because they found it in a section of the law that doesn't even apply to pharmacists and pharmacies. It only applies to physicians and other types of healthcare practitioners, right? So I wouldn't worry about if there's something in the competency statement that you can't find or you think is not applicable in Florida. The other thing I found is some of the students came back and said they were assigned to find, there's a competency statement that talks about the rules for collaborative practice. And several of the students would come back and say, Florida does not address collaborative practice. So, okay, well, that's where you can't just do a Google search or search the regulations and look for specific words, right? Because collaborative practice in Florida is drug therapy management. So Florida uses different terminology for that, right? So collaborative practice means a pharmacist working with a physician or another healthcare practitioner. That is collaborative practice. So MPJE may use the term collaborative practice, but what that means for Florida is make sure you know the drug therapy management rules, right? Another example of that is you might see the competency statements might say, know the requirements for a pharmacist in charge. Well, Florida doesn't use the term pharmacist in charge. They use prescription department manager for community pharmacies, and they use consultant pharmacist of record for a institutional pharmacy. So different terminology, but it's still covered in those competency statements. So I do think it's worth reading those particular competency statements. Okay, let's try another. Oh, before I do that, I don't want you to forget about federal law and state law. We talked about you have to answer the law according to the stricter law. Um, but you don't just want to study the Florida laws to prepare for this exam. You want to study federal laws as well, because things that are going to be covered in on the exam are parts of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the Federal Controlled Substances Act, the Poison Prevention Packaging Act, possibly a little bit of HIPAA, and we'll talk a little bit about USP. So don't ignore the federal law, okay? I think the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, a lot of students don't worry about it. But if you read the competency statements, you'll see things about adulteration and misbranding. You don't have to learn the entire Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, because the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is written a lot for manufacturers and wholesalers and distributors. And you want to touch on the parts of that that apply to pharmacies, and even parts that don't apply to pharmacies, but how could they apply to pharmacies? Because adulteration and misbranding are notorious items for showing up on the MPJE exam. They're not notorious. They show up because they're in the competency statements, right? But adulteration and misbranding should come up in the context of, how could a product become adulterated or misbranded in a pharmacy or by a pharmacist, okay? Even though those terms generally are used more in the pharmaceutical industry for manufacturers, if a product got adulterated or misbranding, if you misfill a prescription, you don't think about, oh my gosh, I've misbranded the product because I mislabeled it or I adulterated it, but on the MPJ, you got to think in those terminologies. Okay, so there's only certain parts of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act I think you need to worry about, things like samples and repackaging, know the difference between compounding versus manufacturing, and always adulteration and misbranding, but more as that applies to a pharmacy. So one of the things we've done in our review guide is try to focus on those areas that are important just for the MPJE. For the Controlled Substances Act, you got to be a little bit more in depth, because most of the rules are going to be the same for federal and state, but you also want to focus on the state rules that are different and more strict that we already talked about. But you definitely want to go through the Federal Controlled Substances Act, and I'll talk about some resources to do that in a moment. The other thing that's covered on federal laws under the MPJE is the Poison Prevention Packaging Act, but again, not the entire act, only as it applies to pharmacies and pharmacists, which is mainly has to do with child-resistant containers, okay? And you got to know all the details of what the exemptions are for that, right? So we go through a lot of that detail in our book as well. I put HIPAA and high tech there also, because one of the competency statements says you need to know about confidentiality and privacy. And a few years ago, they added the words "and HIPAA," which kind of scares me a little bit, because HIPAA can be pretty complex. I do HIPAA work for my company, and I actually have another attorney working on that because it's so complicated. So we purposely added a summary of HIPAA as to our review guide, because the general rules are pretty common sense based, but you got to know a little bit of the details of HIPAA as well. USP comes up. USP are not laws, but obviously there are certain chapters of USP. 797 is one that you got to be very familiar with, because chapters under the number 1000 of USP are technically enforceable by the FDA, and they do apply in pharmacies. And a lot of states, including Florida, have adopted those rules. So Florida has adopted 795, which is the non-sterile compounding, and 797. So you definitely got to be familiar with those. You will see USP chapter 800. I put a question mark by that one because it is in the competency statements. That's the hazardous substances one. But two things. One, the finalization of that rule has been postponed slightly by USP. And secondly, the Board of Pharmacy in Florida has not formally adopted that one yet. So you shouldn't see it, but since it's in the competency statements, and it could show up. But my guess is it probably won't until Florida adopts USP. But definitely USP 797 is one that you want to focus on as far as federal laws and regulations. When it comes to state laws, I think you want to focus on Chapter 465, which is the Pharmacy Act in Florida, obviously, right? And Chapter 893, which is the Controlled Substances Act. So those are the laws or the statutes. But you can't just look at the laws or statutes. That's the other thing I found a lot of my students I've been working with, they would only search the statute or the laws, and they wouldn't look at the rules, okay? You need to understand that the laws or the statutes are passed by the legislature. And so in Florida, that's the Florida legislature, and on the federal level, it's Congress. Okay, but the rules are usually a lot more detailed, and you got to know the details for this exam. So you got to go to the Board of Pharmacy rules to get the details, and the rules are chapter 64B16, and then there's subchapters 26, 27, 28, 30, 32, which they seem to be pretty organized, but I will tell you, going through them like I did, they're not as organized as you think they are. You know, chapter 26 is supposed to be about licensures for pharmacists. Chapter 27 more about what you do in practice. 28 about permits, and then disciplinary. They are sort of organized, but a lot of times there's things in multiple chapters that apply to the same situation. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So don't forget the rules. And one thing good is that they're not going to ask you, is this a statute or a rule? And they're not going to ask you a statute number or a rule number, those types of things. If it's a statute or a rule, doesn't matter. You have to follow it anyway. It is the law, so it's fair game for the MPJE. So don't worry so much about the difference. Just make sure you don't just study one or the other. Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about study resources. On those federal ones, I do think it's worthwhile looking at the DEA Pharmacist Manual to cover the Federal Controlled Substances Act, always keeping in mind that if there's something stricter in Florida, I need to apply the Florida law. But the DEA Pharmacist Manual is good because it summarizes the Controlled Substance Act and rules that are applicable to pharmacies and pharmacists. So it doesn't talk about what a manufacturer has to do or a prescriber and those types of things. So it is a good resource. I think you should at least look at it. My concern with it, I put in parentheses there, it's not updated. The DEA is not updated the Pharmacist Manual since, I believe, 2010. So there are things even on the federal law that are inaccurate in the DEA Pharmacist Manual because it's not up to date. And that's one of the problems with a lot of study resources is they are not up to date, and keeping them up to date. Another good one that's been out there is the Guide to Federal Pharmacy Law by Reese and Hall. It covers FDA law for pharmacies, the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, and the Controlled Substances Act. Does a pretty good job of that, and has lots of questions at the end as well. But remember, again, those questions are only based on the federal law. I could not find a newer edition of this book since 2016, so I have an older version that I looked at, and it's pretty good. Students seem to like that one. As far as state resources, there are a couple of sources out there. I did have trouble when I was trying to put together the review guide that I did. I ended up going to the Board of Pharmacy's website, which is floridasPharmacy.gov, which is kind of an interesting URL for a board, floridasPharmacy.gov, and they have links there to all the statutes and rules. Okay, and I physically had to go there and print them all out and put them in a binder as I was trying to put my review guide together. That's the best way I found. You can buy a compilation of the rules. I found that, but again, it wasn't updated. It was a 3 years old, and it didn't have a lot of new rules in it. Okay, so it's good to go there if you want to read the actual rules. If you are a recent grad and you had a law course, your class notes are always something good to look at. I know Professor Seaman down at Nova does a really excellent job and has a really nice summary that he puts together for his students. So if you have that, it's always good to go back and look at those. As far as practice questions, there's a lot of resources for practice questions. I know people love practice questions. We do have 50, I don't call them practice questions, I call them assessment questions, because in our review guide, it's really to help you assess what's the material in the review guide itself. There are lots of resources out there. The one I wanted to point out is a new one, which is the pre-MPJE, which is brand new, actually. This is the first year we have this. NABP put out a pre-MPJE course exam you can sign up for. And I know some of the colleges have done that for their students to help them. If not, you can sign up on your own. I think it's like $45 or something like that. And this is the only source actually of actual MPJE questions, okay? Because it's done by NABP. Now, there is a company that's got prempje.com. It's not that one. That one may have their own questions. to register for this exam, you got to go to the NABP website. Now, take it with a grain of salt. They're actual questions, but they're actual questions that have been removed, which means they're not using them anymore. So, you have to question, why did they remove them? Were they not well written, or did the law change? But I think it's a resource you should take advantage of. It's the only place I know of to get actual questions. There's lots of other resources out there. I've not reviewed them all, so I really don't want to endorse one over the other, but I know people like practice questions. My only recommendation to you is don't just do practice questions. You got to get a review, make sure you have some base knowledge before you do the practice questions. And if something seems wrong in a practice question, it may be that the law has changed and they haven't updated, or this may be a poorly written question. I went to one website, and the very first question I got, I said, that doesn't sound right to me. And I kept trying to find the answer to that question. And I couldn't find it. I said, maybe I'm wrong here, and I finally looked back at, it took a while to do this, but I not only did I pull up the rule that they were addressing, I pulled up the history of the rule, and it turns out that rule had been changed 6 months ago, right? But the question never got updated, right? So their answer was actually incorrect, right? So that can happen. It can happen to me, it can happen to anybody. And then finally, our resource, I do want to mention, I'll talk about it at the very end. Our book is called The Ultimate Florida MPJE Review. We use the same title for our Texas guide, but this one is focused. First 2 chapters are federal with state law incorporated, and then the rest of the book is all Florida law. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Okay. So let's try another poll question, and maybe that will give us another study tip. So here's the poll question I wanted you to answer. A single written or electronic prescription issued for methylphenidate may not exceed, is it A, a 7-day supply, B, a 30-day supply, C, a 90-day supply, or D, there is no legal limit? We'll see the results are coming in now. Give you a few minutes to do that. All right, let's see what we got. Okay. So nobody went for 7-day supply, huh? We got the majority of people say 30-day supply, 90-day supply, or there is no legal limit. Okay, so the answer is actually there is no legal limit. Okay, which is surprising to a lot of you probably, right? So that brings us to a misconception, right? So there's a lot of misconceptions I find, and since I've been teaching pharmacy law for 25 years, I've kind of learned what the misconceptions are, not only with pharmacy students, but also with pharmacists, right? But on the MPJE, you got to know the details of this stuff, right? So there's not a specific quantity limit, believe it or not, either under federal law or under Florida law on a single Schedule II prescription. Now, there is a 90-day supply limit on Schedule II prescriptions, but that only applies when the practitioner is issuing multiple Schedule IIs at the same time. And that's why this question was very specific. It said it's a single prescription. It's also very specific. It's issued by a physician, right? Because there might be a limit, as there is in Florida and other states, if it's a PA or a nurse practitioner or some other type of prescriber. So you got to look at, who's prescribing it, what schedule the drug's in, but you got to apply the law, okay? Now, true, you may not ever dispense a large quantity like that. Why? Because you have to apply other laws such as pharmacist corresponding responsibility, okay? But on an exam like this, where if you don't have any other facts in the law on the question, just answer it according to the law. So the correct answer there would be there is no legal limit, okay? Don't let them trick you on that, all right? So that's study tip number 2, okay? Remember, this is a law exam. Don't answer a question just based on restrictions from an insurance company, right? A lot of times, a lot of insurance company might restrict Schedule II products to a 30-day supply. That's an insurance company They're not going to ask you what insurance companies do. Or you may have a store policy where you work that says we're not going to give more than a 7-day supply or a 10-day. I know Walmart's done that with some of the opioids, right? And I purposely didn't pick an opioid in that question because there is a law in Florida regarding opioids, obviously. But answer the question only based on the law, not based on what some insurance company restriction is, or what a store policy is. Okay, an MPJE question can't be based on what the insurance company tells you to do or what the store policy is. Okay. All right, let's try another one, and we'll get to our next study tip, which is kind of similar. Which products in a pharmacy are required to be stored in a secured cabinet that is locked or in a safe? Is it A, all controlled substances? Or is it B, all Schedule II controlled substances? Or is it C, all controlled substances that are classified as narcotics? Or is it none of the above? Okay, and again, this is a good question because it points out how carefully you got to read these questions and know the different requirements, right? Is the question asking me about all controls, just Schedule IIs? Is it a subclass of Schedule IIs, which is getting to be a problem, you know? It used to be a lot of the questions were only based on, is it Schedule II, and these are the rules. Is it Schedule III, 4, or 5? These are generally the rules, right? But now we got subclasses based on opioids and things like that that make rules different depending on what type of drug it is, not just what schedule it's in, okay? So let's see what we got here. So people think it's Schedule IIs, which is good, or none of the above. And another trick question, right? So the correct answer here is actually D, none of the above, okay? Now, so that brings us to our next study tip is be careful, because what's done in practice, or what may be the best practice, may be the wrong answer on the MPJE, right? So many things are done in practice because they are the best practice, but they're not technically required by law, and it can really trip you up on the MPJE, right? It gets back to those misconceptions, right? You got to know specifically what the law. So just because where you worked or where you did your rotations, they locked up all the Schedule IIs, that is an option you can do, right? But it's technically not required under federal law or by Florida law, right? So it's good practice, but you don't have to do it. Same thing with things like, can a patient request non-childproof caps? Can they do that verbally? Or does it have to be in writing? Well, it's good practice to get it in writing. I always recommend people get it in writing, but the law says it can be done verbally by the patient, okay, and that's valid. So always make sure you know what's technically required versus what is actually good practice, because a lot of times the law, people go beyond what's required in the law. And unfortunately, sometimes it's the opposite. You might have seen stuff being done wrong in a pharmacy that's technically a violation of the law. Not that everybody's a bad pharmacist out there, but sometimes there's a lot of regulations and people just do things technically incorrectly. But you got to know the technical correct way of doing things on the MPJE exam. All right, let's do another one. What type of prescription is limited to a 3-day supply? You notice we got a lot of day supply questions, right? Is it A, all opioid prescriptions for acute pain? Is it all Schedule II prescriptions for acute pain? Or is it all Schedule II opioid prescriptions for acute pain? Or is it just all controlled substances for acute pain? Again, it gets into the terminology, and it demonstrates why you got to read these questions carefully, right? Because Schedule IIs are not just opioids, right? Opioids could be different schedules, right? Narcotics is defined differently. Opioids defined differently. Definitions are very, very important when you're studying the law, okay? So let's see what we're getting here. All opioids for acute pain, all Schedule II prescriptions for acute pain, all Schedule II opioid prescriptions for acute pain, all controlled substances. Yeah, see, people are kind of all over the board. So this brings up our next, the correct answer is all Schedule II opioids for acute pain. And this is a very specific regulation in Florida, right? So this is the Florida restrictions on the treatment of acute pain, okay? This is where it's important that you read those definitions carefully, right? The definitions say Schedule II opioids, okay? So it's not all scheduled. There are opioids that are not in Schedule 2. Most of them are Schedule 2 now, but you know, you could have Tylenol number 3 or something like that, right? It's those that are limited in Florida to a 3-day supply limit, okay? There's also an acute pain exception where they can then, if the doctor does certain things, they can then get a 7-day supply, right? And if they're not treating acute pain, then these restrictions don't apply. And then there's, again, special rules if it's a traumatic injury with an injury severity score of 9 or greater, okay? Very, very detailed requirements here. I think you need to know those, okay? So what this brings us to our next study tip is you gotta know not just the definitions, but you gotta know those unique Florida requirements. All of these requirements on the restrictions on the treatment of acute pain, that is all specific to Florida, okay? States, a lot of states are starting to do this, right? So I think if you ever take the MPJE in another state, you should look at it, you know? Texas, where I practice, has something similar, but the rules are different, okay? And a lot of states are starting to do this, and they're not making it for all Schedule 2s, they're making it for just all opioids. In Florida, it's Schedule 2 opioids, but in Texas, it's, you know, it's any opioid, doesn't matter. So the rules are different in different states. So make sure you know the unique Florida requirements, and it's not just for these controlled substance items. So, you know, as I go through the Florida rules and regulations, you know, some of the things that I think are unique to Florida, definitely need to know about, are things like the negative formulary. You know, most states don't have a thing called a negative formulary, right? So if I'm writing questions to test people's Florida pharmacy law knowledge, I'm going to pick things that are unique to Florida, right? So the negative formulary, which is part of generic substitution in Florida. There's a section on pharmacist order for medicinal drugs. That's technically pharmacist prescribing, but it's not what you think it is. It's not a very new law. It's actually a very old law that was passed. Actually, it passed when I was graduating pharmacy school, so you know it's got to be old, right? At that time, we thought Florida was on the cutting edge, and we passed this great law that Florida pharmacists can now prescribe. Well, if you look at the formulary of drugs on there, it's not really that exciting. It's a lot of OTC drugs and maybe dosages of drugs that are technically prescription at that dosage level. But because it's unique to Florida, I think you need to know, and I don't think a lot of people even use it anymore, but since it's unique to Florida, I do think you need to know that formulary and know the requirements for that. Terminology, that we talked about this earlier, the prescription department manager is a term unique to Florida, so don't get confused about that. Most pharmacists, if you're coming from out of state, you know, you think of that as the pharmacist in charge, or PIC. The consultant pharmacist of record, okay, is similar. It's like the PIC for an institutional pharmacy, but Florida takes that one step further. You got a separate license you got to get to be a consultant pharmacist. Additional training required for that, and then additional CE is required to maintain your consult. So every consultant pharmacist of record for a hospital pharmacy in Florida, or for if you're serving us in a nursing home, has to be a consultant pharmacist. And so you got to know all those specific Florida requirements to be and to maintain your license as a consultant pharmacist of record. The PDMP, okay, nearly every state has a PDMP. Last time I checked, Missouri was the only state that didn't have one. Hopefully they have one by now. So obviously, the requirements for the prescription drug monitoring program is called eForce in Florida. That's going to be unique to each state, and you know, a lot of that's done automatically. Your computer system reports to the state, but they may ask you on the MPJE what's reported. You know, what are the required elements that have to be reported. You know, that's not something you worry about in practice because it's done automatically by your computer. But on the MPJE, they may want you to know, you know, what am I exactly reporting to the board? I'm reporting the prescription number, the name of the patient, the name of the prescriber, the date. You know, those types of list of items are the details you got to know. And the other thing that varies from state to state is how often do I have to report? Again, not something you worry about because it's done by the computer. But on the MPJE, that's a very typical type of question that any state could ask you, is like, how frequently do I have to do it? And then in Florida, where it's a mandatory requirement, which is also something new and also kind of unique. What are the exceptions of that? And what happens if the system goes down? All those kind of details are going to vary from state to state. So make sure you know the requirements of the Florida PDMP. And then that very first question I gave you about the verbal prescription for testosterone, I picked that question. Remember, under federal law, there's no limit, but that's a very unique very unique Florida law, it's actually in the Florida Controlled Substances Act, that says Schedule 3 verbal prescriptions are limited to a 30-day supply in Florida for everyone. Again, very unique to Florida, a very good source of a question. If I was writing a question, that'd be an easy one to come up with. So those are the 4 kind of study tips I wanted to kind of go over. I think those are all helpful as you prepare your study plan and figure out the best way to go through this. The one thing I did find as I was preparing our review guide was Florida, and also there's some federal laws involved here. There's a lot of limitations on days supply. Okay, and those, as I mentioned, make for really good questions, particularly those questions that require you to put things in an ordered response, put these in order from least to longest, the shortest time period to the longest period. So that's a great source for those, and there's a lot of them in Florida. Okay, there's a limitation on drugs dispensed by a practitioner from an emergency room. Even though it's by a practitioner, you need to know that, because if you're the hospital pharmacy in that emergency room, you got to set up those policies. We talked about the emergency verbals for Schedule 2s. What about emergency refills? There's a limitation on that versus a regular emergency or a governor-declared emergency, like we are in now, obviously, with the pandemic situation. A governor-declared emergency, the rules might be different. Which brings up a quick point I wanted to make. Right now, because of this pandemic situation we're in, I just want to point this out. A lot of the rules have been waived. Okay, both by states and by the DEA. Part of what I'm doing in my real job at Cardinal Health right now is we are monitoring all 50 state boards of pharmacies, and 2 or 3 times a week I'm putting out a new list of all the rules that have been waived by state boards of pharmacies, and the DEA is even waiving rules. For instance, the 5% rule that allows pharmacies to do 5% of their business as distributions without being licensed, registered as a distributor. DEA has currently waived that rule. Just because it's currently waived is not going to change the questions on the MPJE. If you get a question on the 5% rule, and we're still in a pandemic situation while you're taking your exam, don't rely on the fact that it's currently waived, so there is no 5% rule. Right? They're not going to have time to adjust their questions during the pandemic and only have questions that apply during the pandemic. Okay, so if you get a question on the 5% rule, DEA's 5% rule, answer it the way the law generally is, even though that rule is temporarily waived by the DEA. But again, these day supplies limits, there's a lot of them. Drugs dispensed from a limited community pharmacy permit. There's a day supply limit on Schedule 2 prescriptions from PAs. The DEA has that 90-day supply limit when multiple Schedule 2s are issued the same day. There's a day supply limit if you're unable to check the PDMP, right? We talked about the Schedule 2 opioids for pain. All of those have different day supplies limits. So one of the things that I decided to do at the last chapter in my review guide was I tried to put them all together into a chart. I think it'll help you study, because there were so many of them. I was surprised how many of those were. So that's something I think will be helpful if you're able to get that review guide. And by the way, I know several of you, when you registered, we saw the names, have already purchased a review guide. So thank you for purchasing that. I hope you found it useful as you prepared your studies. I want to talk quickly. I know we're going a little bit over time here, but we got started late. About some of the challenges I found when I was putting together the review guide that I did, and we actually did an all-day review for the University of Florida, and so where we went through the book in detail, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We're thinking about doing that as well for all of you. But what I found was the laws in Florida are not really well organized, even though they've got those chapters. They're different, and this is true at any state, right? The laws are always difficult to read and understand because they're written in legalese sometimes, and they'll refer back to another section. You got to pull up that section, and so what I've always tried to do in Texas, and I've tried to do with the first edition of this book in Florida, is I try to pull the laws and the regulations together from different sections that are on one topic and bring them together and try to reorganize things rather than simply going through the regulations. Now, to do that, I had to read through each law and every regulation and kind of give it a topic area and then go back and try and summarize it, right? So I've tried to do that. I try to organize it and make it a little bit better. I did find the Florida rules are a lot more detailed than other states. Texas is pretty detailed as well. Our textbook in Texas is over 600 pages long. So Florida is very similar. Florida's got a lot of rules. Other states don't have a lot of rules, right? So they're much easier MPJEs to take, I think. You know, the MPJE is, I think it does vary from state. I do think some states are more difficult than others, and those that have more regulations tend to be more detailed and tend to be a little bit more difficult. I even found things that conflict in the laws, right? And topics being covered in multiple places. I try to address a lot of those things in my review guide, saying like these things seem to conflict, but here's what how I think you should apply the law in that situation, what they're trying to accomplish, right? And by reorganizing things in multiple places, I think that does make things a little bit easier. So let me just finish by talking a little bit about the review guide we did come up with. As I mentioned, it's the Ultimate Florida MPJE Review Guide 2020. It is in Florida Gator orange and blue, since I'm a Florida grad. We do cover federal laws and Florida laws. Like I said, I organized it in an outline format, so it's easy to follow by topic. So when I get to a topic, it will tell you the rule number in case you want to go read the details, but it might be more than one rule number. It might say 64B 1627.405 and 64B 28.25, because both of those areas talk about the same thing, okay? I put a lot of study tips. Some of those study tips that I provided to you today, those are typical types of study tips that are in there. I have a lot of them, okay? Because I've found 25 years of doing this, there's certain things that are difficult to understand, difficult concepts for students to understand. So I put study tips to make sure people understand those, or stuff that I think is very important. So those are all outlined with study tips throughout the guide. All right. We did include 50 assessment questions at the end. You can test your knowledge of the material that's in the book. I can't tell you that these are typical MPJE questions because I don't write the MPJE questions. And then, as I mentioned, I do have a couple charts in the back. I got one for days supply, which I think are helpful. The other one is for notifications. How many days do I have to notify the Board of Pharmacy about something like that? I can tell you the book is up to date and it's comprehensive because it was done, you know, earlier this year. The book is available on Amazon. Maybe I put maybe because of the pandemic situation, Amazon has not allowed us to restock inventory for the past 6 weeks until actually earlier this week was the first time. So we were out of stock for some time on Amazon. Earlier this week, they did finally allow us to restock, and so there should be inventory going in now as we speak. But they're controlling how quickly we can restock, and they're not letting us restock the way we normally do. So it may show out of stock on Amazon. The other thing is, and you may have found this with other items you order from Amazon, unless it's a household product or medical product, you're not getting 2-day prime delivery on anything. So even if it is in stock, it may have delayed delivery. It may take a week or two for delivery. So you can check that. So because of that, we did add a direct purchase option on our website, which is floridapharmacylaw.com. If things are delayed at Amazon, or you can't, or the inventory runs out, which is again beyond our control at this point, you can order directly from us. There is a delivery charge. We're not Amazon, so we can't offer free delivery, unfortunately. But it is an option for you, because I know time is of the essence sometimes. And if we're out of stock on Amazon, we want to give people a different option. Okay, well, that's really all we have time for. I do want to stop with one final poll question, and that is this. If we are going to offer a 6 or 7 hour complete MPJE review, would you definitely attend, likely not attend, or definitely not attend? And we will get all the technical problems taken care of. We're thinking about doing that. I do want to offer it. There would be a fee for this, obviously. It's not something we offer for free. But we want to run that out there and just kind of see what kind of response we get from you. It looks like everybody's interested. And look, if you want to say, no, I'm not going to have my feelings hurt, so that's fine. Okay, great. One honest person there. I know it may depend on the fee, and we're working on that. What we'll do is if we decide to offer this, I think we probably will based on this response, What we'll try to do is we'll have two separate fees. One for people who've already purchased the book, so you just get the webinar, but it will be comprehensive. We will go through that review guide in detail. So I'm going to recommend that you have it with you. Otherwise, it's not going to be very valuable to you. So we'll have two different registration fees, one for the webinar only, and one that will include the webinar, plus we'll ship you a book for an all-in-one price. So we will probably do that. Here's a couple of dates we're looking at. We're looking at late May and 2 dates in early June. So if you are interested, if you let us know what dates are helpful to you, we may have to go into June only because in order to ship books to people, so they have it for the web.